Okay, welcome tonight. I first met Adam about 3 or 4 years ago when I was the bureau chief for Time magazine in New Delhi, and was kind of struck immediately by 3 things about Adam that I think are kind of required in making a good photographer. The first was that he, and this was the kind of most immediately apparent, was that he was very enthusiastic. He was relatively new to photography, had done work with Gary Knight from VII, and had worked in both France and in Southeast Asia, right? Had kind of come to India because he thought that it was a good place to take photos, and he was already involved in a lot of his own projects in different parts of India, which made me think immediately that he was someone who I should kind of look at as someone that we should use at Time. The second thing which became apparent in one of our early assignments together was that he was quite brave. We went down to an area in central India which is essentially out of the control of the central government of India. It's controlled by what Indians call Naxalites, Maoist rebels, and we spent about a week in a little village called Dantewara, waiting to be taken into a camp that the rebels had, and waited and waited and waited. And essentially almost had given up. Finally, one morning, they told us, okay, today's the day. We then went on a motorbike for a few hours through the jungle, basically, ditched the motorbikes at a certain point, and then had to walk a few hours into this camp, which was, as promised, you know, Indian Maoist rebels in their kind of ragtag clothes, with their ragtag weaponry, but no doubt in complete control of this huge swathe of central India that the government doesn't control. I was fairly close to the end of my time in India, and for various kind of personal reasons wanted to get back to Delhi, and the wait in the village for a week had eaten up a lot of time. Adam, on the other hand, was very gung-ho and wanted to stay for days and days and days. We didn't, in the end, stay for as long as I'm sure he wanted to, but he was, given that he hadn't done a whole lot of that sort of thing before, was incredibly poised and brave, I thought. The third thing was that he was insistent, I think, which I think is really important in a photographer. Kind of has a quiet determination. He really knows what he wants. He knew that he wanted to shoot conflict, and was working out how to do that, was working out ways to make it work for him. I think that we're going to begin this evening with Adam showing us some of his work. Then I'll ask Adam a few questions, and then we're going to really open it up, because I'm sure that people here have a lot of questions. So let me hand it over to Adam to show some of his photos.
Great, thanks Simon, and thanks everybody for thanks everybody for coming along tonight. I'm going to show a set of pictures that I made last year during the Afghan presidential elections, and I'm going to show a couple of single images, an image that I won a World Press Award with earlier in the year, and then I'm going to show a slideshow which constitutes my main body of work, which is the stuff I'm doing with the US military in Afghanistan. So I'm going to talk through the first set of pictures from the Afghan elections, and then the next set I'll run some music to, and we'll let that play. So photographing the elections last year was a pretty interesting experience. I was there unassigned, hanging out at a dodgy little guest house in Kabul, hanging out with a bunch of ragtag photographers, a few good friends, Jared Musi and Ron Haviv. And none of us were on assignment, so we basically, you know, pulled our money and jumped in a car every morning and, you know, just went and found what was going on. And I think one of the most important things I've discovered as working as a photographer and a freelance photojournalist is you just kind of, you keep at it even when the assignments aren't coming in. And this was really a situation where I worked like that. So you know, when there was bombings and there was polling day and whatnot, and we would just go and photograph and see what we found. And in between these, I guess what you'd call news moments that everybody was very focused on, we'd go and find out, you know, what was happening and try and look for some of the quieter moments that were happening. Whether that was kids flying kites, like in this picture, or you know, going to election rallies, and not so much being focused on the presidential candidates themselves, but just concentrating on the people and the whole mood of the country at this point in time. And then obviously there was moments of, you know, absolute drama. This picture I took outside a bank in the old city in Kabul, and it was the day before. It was the day before polling day, basically, and a couple of insurgents stormed a bank, and they had a standoff that went for about 2 hours with Afghan commandos. And the result of that was the commandos storming the bank and basically killing the, I think there was 4 of them, killing the 4 guys that, you know, had kind of created this siege. And the police were very heavy-handed that day, and just out of pure, you know, luck or coincidence or whatever you like to call it, Ron, Jared and myself got separated from the press pack, which at the moment we were very worried about because we thought we were going to kind of miss the action. But we ended up on this corner, and the police and the commandos dragged out the bodies of the insurgents after they killed them. So and they let us photograph, which was quite rare. So we had these few minutes of photographing this moment of these commandos dragging these bullet-riddled bodies out of one of the banks. And then between these moments that I'm talking about, we just wandered off. This is a picture from a market in Kabul. And this is a scene of a beggar on a street in Kabul after a presidential rally. I basically just, after it was over, the candidate was Bashar Dost. He was a Hazara candidate, and after he'd packed up and gone home and all his supporters had disappeared, I just kind of mingled around the streets and continued to photograph, and this is what I saw. And this is another scene that day from the bank. See a stretcher after a suicide bombing that hit an Italian convoy on Jalalabad Road in Kabul. Sometimes it's quite hard to photograph in situations like this because the police lock down the situations very quickly. So it's really hard to get in and produce images which are emotive. So this was, you know, I turned up at this along with all the other press photographers, and we all milled around, and no one made very interesting pictures of the event because we couldn't get close enough. So when it was all said and done, I photographed a detail which was, you know, a trace of what had gone on. A bloody stretcher. And this is a photograph of a woman that was injured in that blast in one of the hospitals in Kabul. And on polling day, they basically set up booths in all the schools around Kabul, and this is a bunch of Afghan women voting.
I'm interested that you've interspersed the quite violent pictures of violence with these much quieter moments. Is that quite deliberate?
Yeah, it is deliberate. I basically wanted to show that it's not a sensational, you know, action-infused period of time, you know, and daily life goes on amidst all the stuff that we get very occupied with, and the media focuses on, especially television media. I wanted to, I guess, intersperse all the quieter moments of things that were happening at that time to create the mood, I guess. This is an abandoned restaurant the day after the elections. So I wanted to show this photo quickly, and Flora asked me to show it because it was a picture that won an award in the World Press this year. So basically what happened was I was sitting at the New York Times bureau. I was on assignment for the New York Times, and I was sitting in my room filing some pictures that I'd taken the day before, and there was this very loud boom. And it was close. The window shook, and I knew it was something big, and obviously I had to run out the door and go find it. So I grabbed my cameras and I ran out the front door and started running down the street to see if I could see the smoke cloud. And it wasn't too long before I found it. And not long after that, one of the very dedicated drivers at the New York Times turned up to pick me up, and we went and found the scene. And I was one of the first photographers there, along with Dario. I can't remember his surname, but he's a Associated Press photographer. And him and I went in and photographed, basically. It was one of those situations where you don't think too much about what's happening or whether there's going to be a secondary blast, or, you know, you're basically running on, well, it sounds cliche, but running on adrenaline and, you know, documenting the event. And, you know, there was bodies all over the ground, and this woman had been in one of the buildings that you can, on the other side of the road, but they were devastated, like you can see the ones in the background of this photograph. And this is an Afghan Commando, and I'm not sure who the other guy is. He's got a radio. I think he might be Afghan intelligence, but it's hard to tell. And yeah, they're obviously escorting her from the scene, and she's, you know, very traumatized. So I'm going to play the slideshow I mentioned now, which is my main body of work. Full screen. And it's basically a set of pictures that I've been working on for the last 18 months that documents the US military presence in Afghanistan. Most of it's been done on assignment for Time magazine, and I've been fortunate enough to have Time support a lot of my personal trips. So let's let this roll. on.
So I'll ask Adam a few questions now. I was going to begin kind of pre-Afghanistan, but I think after that, actually, I'll jump straight into Afghanistan. You know, it's incredibly powerful body of work that Adam's building up in that country. When did you first go there?
I first went to Afghanistan in early 2007.
And when you arrived, you were going on assignment for someone, or were you going just as a freelancer, or?
I went as a freelancer the first time I went. I was based in New Delhi, and I flew over on a civilian flight to Kabul and to see what I could find.
And what happened? What were your first kind of the first things you did there, photographically?
I was very naive the first time I went over. I wasn't really sure what to expect when I landed in a war zone, where there'd be rockets flying through the sky and whatnot. But, you know, daily life goes on in a war zone, so, you know, it was quite passive really in Kabul. And Kabul itself is quite safe. Some of you guys, you know, have probably even been there. So the first thing I did, Simon, basically was learn how to navigate the military bureaucracy. And Aaron Baker, who was the Time magazine correspondent over there, took me under her wing and helped me do that, and offered me a few contacts with the US military, and I ended up doing my first embed, which was in Herat, in Regional Command West, and I did a story for Time with Aaron on the training of the Afghan National Police.
Okay. Some of the photos there, especially in the first kind of section of that, the montage that you just showed us, came from, I think, early 2009, early last year, right?
Yeah.
Where you and Aaron were in the east of the country, the ones in the mountains, including one which actually made the cover of Time magazine, the guy smoking on top of the mountain.
Yeah.
Tell us about that embed, and in particular, and it kind of came through in Aaron's story in quite stark terms, when the moment you kind of came under fire.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Aaron and I went to the Korengal Valley, which has become a pretty well-known place in the war in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of journalists go there, and I think it was Sebastian Junger wrote a book recently called Restrepo, and there was a few photos there actually from Restrepo. But that was basically the first time I embedded and went to a very kinetic part of the country where I knew that I was going to get in a conflict situation. So I was quite scared, obviously, to go there for the first time. So Aaron and I made it to the Korengal after a pretty grueling wait on Jalalabad airfield. It took us a week until we got up there. And we got up there and we got into it. And where am I going with this? The first time, basically, I got in, we were ambushed, the story Simon's referring to, was basically the first time I really realised whether I could work in a conflict situation. That's always a bit disillusioning as a young photographer that had ambition to cover conflict. I wasn't sure how I would cope with a situation like that. You know, whether I'd dive in a ditch and stop to make pictures, which I still do sometimes, or whether I'd be able to hack it. So Aaron and I were on a patrol one afternoon, and I think there was a very dark picture you guys might remember from the slideshow of a soldier. It's a nighttime picture and there's fire and stuff on the mountains. That was basically taken just after this moment where we were ambushed. And we'd been on a presence patrol to a village called Louis Calais in the Korengal Valley. And
was that the photo where you're sitting around eating, or not? Where the US soldiers are sitting around with the village elders? Was that from that same night?
No, that's from a different meeting with the elders. And I'm reluctant to tell this story because I don't want to come across as sitting here telling, you know, a war story. But I'll tell this story because I think it's an important part in my career, because it's when I first came under fire. Anyway, so it came time to exit this village, and we waited till it was almost dark, because it was quite common that they'd get attacked when they left it. The troops would get attacked when they left this village. And as we come up out of the village, we sure enough got attacked, and the US troops had arranged for a Humvee to be quite close to the trail that we could take cover behind, and they'd got it wrong. So the moment we hit the trail, we started getting shot at from about 3 different directions, and then we had to run to the Humvee and take cover. So there was Aaron, Baker and myself, and we were holed up behind this Humvee with about 10 troops. And you know, it was really scary. We were all, you know, in the dirt basically, and the troops were screaming, and I know Aaron and I were very scared. I can remember the look on her face. And it was one of those moments where it's, you know, you're kind of risking your life and you decide whether you're going to make pictures or whether you're not. And I decided to make pictures. And from the position we were hiding behind the Humvee, then we had to run about 200 metres to the nearest fire base. And that's where the US troops had reinforcement that was returning fire. And we had to make that dash. And, you know, it was exciting and all the rest of it, and it was incredibly scary. And I decided that I wanted to continue to do more of that kind of work after that.
I think there are some photography students here as well. This is a very old question, especially for photojournalists. I know there are other photojournalists here, and they're probably sick of this question, but I will ask you, why do you think photographers, when something like that happens, rush toward it, whereas the natural human instinct is to rush away?
I think we're all a bit crazy, Simon. That's probably the bottom line. But I think we're all very passionate, and we're all very driven to tell the stories that we tell. And I think, you know, we make calculated risks, and that's the bottom line. And when you put yourself in a situation where it's inherently dangerous anyway, it's not much more of an effort to go the full distance and to try and get whatever you can out of a situation, and to, you know, to make images that are powerful and really hit home.
Do you feel that over your time in Afghanistan, the passion that you obviously have for the place, has that built, or did you feel it almost instantly when you arrived?
I think it's built, and it's also waned. You know, it's not a pleasant place to work. You know, it's easy to romanticize the life of you know, a photojournalist and the things that we do, but you know, most of the time it's really unpleasant. You know, you're doing long patrols, you're eating really bad food, you're getting shot at, you risk getting your legs blown off, and it really becomes about the work, I think, at the end of the day. And
do you think over the last couple of years, do you think that the interest level from editors, wherever they are in New York or London or wherever, has that gone up, gone down? I mean, where is Afghanistan now in terms of interest?
I think Afghanistan is definitely one of the main stories at the moment, and the news is very interested in what's happening in Afghanistan. Obviously there's been the withdrawal of a lot of troops from Iraq, and I think there's been a shift in focus and attention, as you can see in the media, to Afghanistan. And a lot of the press crowd has actually migrated to Afghanistan now, and their presence has been downsized in Iraq.
Well, what you mentioned that it's, you know, a very tough place to shoot. What do you find the best things about being there are?
The best things about being there is, I guess, living a life that I would never, you know, it's getting an insight into different people's lives that I wouldn't normally come across, and that's why I'm drawn to storytelling with a camera. At the end of the day, I think, is to, you know, to experience different people's lives, and to get yourself in situations that you wouldn't normally get at. I'm curious at the end of the day, and I think all photographers tend to be inherently curious and to seek something beyond their own life.
Let's just jump back. Where did you begin taking photos?
I began taking photos in Australia, and I actually started a bachelor's program at Griffith University in Australia. And at the time I didn't realise I wanted to be a documentary photographer or a photojournalist, whatever you'd like to call it. I landed at college with a Pentax K1000 that my mum had given me, and luckily in my first year of college was saddled with the photojournalism stream convener, and he really pushed me in that direction, and he sent me out on an assignment one day. Well, he sent the whole class out on an assignment one day, and I found myself instantly telling stories. I met this old man who ran a second-hand car yard, And I took back to class a set of pictures which were details of his life and a portrait of him. And I didn't realise that I was making documentary imagery at the time. But when I got back to class and put my pictures out on the floor, it was pretty apparent that that's what I was doing. And my lecturer was pretty influential in pushing me in that direction after that. So it wasn't ever really about the photography. It became recently about storytelling.
And then you worked on newspapers in Australia.
Yeah, I had no money when I finished college, so I worked as a deckhand on a boat for quite a long time to save enough money to buy a digital camera and a laptop. And after that, I worked on newspapers in Australia for about 8 months for my hometown newspaper, and then I interned with VII Photo Agency in Paris. And after that is when I made the leap to working internationally, and I moved to New Delhi in India and based myself there and started working.
Okay. And now, you mentioned that working in Afghanistan is your interest or your passion has kind of grown, but also waned. Does that mean that you won't be shooting there anymore? Does it mean that that you want to take a break from it? What does that mean?
I think it means I've got to do what I guess all photographers do when they hit a bit of a pivotal point in large projects, and it's overcoming a sense of boredom with it and trying to find a new way to tell it. And I think that's where I'm at with the work. So I will be working back in Afghanistan, and I've got a couple of trips planned next year. So I'll get back over there and get back into it. But one of the things that I really need to look at, I feel, with my work is how I've had a lot of criticism about my work, that's kind of straight war photography. And I think it's quite easy to criticise, especially embedded photography, as work that is really about something that we've seen multiple times before. And there's the notion that the public gets very tired of looking at embedded photography and looking at war images. But I think regardless of that, I think it's very important that the story continues to get told, and I think it's very important that photographers try and look at larger bodies of work and larger narratives about conflict situations. So I'm going to go back there and try and push myself and see where I can go with it.
And not embed, or
I'll embed more.
You'll embed again. Yeah. But the criticism is that your photos are come mostly through embeds. Is it a problem with the embed, or is it that they focus too directly on conflict?
I think there's two things. I think people are tired with seeing war pictures.
But isn't it at that point, isn't it our or a photojournalist kind of duty to kind of still hold it up and say, well, you might not like it, but it's still going on?
Exactly. I think that's our duty indeed, and that's what I'll continue to do. People have to see the work, and regardless of how tired these stories become, I think it's important that we keep ramming them down people's throats, and there's a constant dialogue that's refreshed for these kinds of conflicts.
And I cut you off there. I'm sorry.
Sure.
You were going to say there were two main points. One was that it was too directly war, and what was the second one?
I guess embedded photography comes under quite a bit of criticism because it's essentially one side of a story. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have differed a lot to previous wars where photographers could travel unilaterally and they could, embed with the underdog and the occupier and basically travel around and photograph without being stuck with a bunch of troops. So, that's the criticism that embedded photography's copped. And it's a very valid criticism, I think. But that doesn't change the fact that it's still very important. And I think half the story is better than none of the story. So I think it's quite important that photographers continue to embed and do whatever they can given the situation. And we'd all love to embed with whatever insurgent group or the Taliban or one of the multiple groups that's active in Afghanistan, but it's really dangerous and it doesn't really, the work's not really, the risks aren't justified at the end of the day.
It's an interesting word because the embed program, which kind of was born out of the Afghanistan invasion. I mean, it had existed before in places like Vietnam and stuff. It just didn't have that name. Right. And I'm not sure. Maybe someone who's much smarter than me on the history of photojournalism would know whether it had come in for a lot of criticism in previous conflicts. Maybe.
I think they first called it embedded. Like embedded journalism was established in one of the Gulf Wars, I think. That's when yeah.
Okay, well, let's, I think, maybe throw it open to the floor. People, Flora, you're going to pass around the microphone. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and we can ask Adam. Great.
Hi, quick question about going back to the chair's question on why some people run towards it and you, I guess, run... Sorry, the other way around. Once some run away from it, you run towards it. Have you ever had a kind of humble moment where you said, this is enough, I need to get my head down, I need to know when to quit? Either from exhaustion or just total exposure and you realise this is quite, reckless, or the risk isn't worth it?
I have. I was on a patrol. Actually, it was on that same embed when I was in the Korengal Valley in 2007. And as the patrol was going out the front gate of the combat operations post, I just had this really bad feeling. And there was two other journalists on the trip too from the New York Times. And something just didn't feel right. And I was one of the last people in the column of soldiers that were walking out. And I got 5 meters out the gate and I had a sick feeling in my stomach, and I turned around and walked back inside. And 300 meters after they got out of the gate, they were attacked. Well, actually, sorry, they weren't attacked in gunfire as such, but one of the soldiers stepped on an IED, improvised explosive device, and was blown into pieces and killed. And I always wondered what would have happened that day if I had walked out the gate, and that turned into a nightmare for that patrol. The New York Times photographer fell in a river and ruined all his kit. And they didn't realise a soldier being killed because he'd been blown into that many pieces that, you know, he basically didn't exist anymore. And it wasn't until they started to come home that they realised that they were a man down, and then they spent the next 5 hours out there trying to establish, you know, where he was or what had happened, or to find him, and they ended up finding, you know, a couple of pieces of him in a helmet, basically. So, you know, I think it's a very, back to your question, it's a very intuitive line that you walk all the time, and it's very important, I think, to keep that. And you tend to get very superstitious. You pick your lucky soldier and you sit on them. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll go to your friend and then behind.
Sure. I was going to ask, in some of the more dangerous situations, where do you and how do you draw the line between photographing a situation and trying to intervene or to try and help with a situation?
Generally, when I'm embedded with the military, I don't have to intervene with help. There's combat medics who are much more trained than I am. So, you know, when stuff gets kinetic or if people are injured, I tend to be able to just do my job. I don't really have to think about involving myself. And, you know, I've never obviously picked up a gun, and I hope I never have to.
Has there ever been a situation where you've seen something that you've helped in some way, or, I mean, that's also another kind of classic question for photographers, isn't it? Whether, at what point do you put the camera down, or do you?
Right.
It's a philosophical debate, isn't it?
Sure. I've never been in a situation where I've been challenged on that level of should I put the camera down and should I help in Afghanistan, I'm talking about. But, you know, there's situations where you become very part of the story. You know, you're out there with these soldiers and you can spend weeks on end with them and you become friends. So, you know, the line of, you know, where you are as a journalist and where the story is can get a bit blurred, and you find yourself in situations where, you know, you will help soldiers, or, you know, you might have a rifle or a machine gun sitting next to you and a soldier asks you to pass it to him, and you do, and you get involved in very small, subtle ways, but yeah, anyway.
Okay.
I have a comment and a question. You said, I mean, in regards to the criticism about, I mean, being embedded as a photojournalist, that half the story is better than no story. But I mean, critically, I think that half the story, when it becomes the whole story, that is where the problem actually, becomes of some sort of like biased reporting. And the question that is very reflective on the comment is that how do you as a photojournalist see the difference between your work as a freelance photojournalist and working for a magazine with a certain editorial policy or editorial agenda? Because looking at the slides, the first set of photographs that you showed us before the presentation were pretty much different than the photos that were taken when you were working for the Time.
Sure.
And they showed a completely different angle and different, the other half of the story, I guess. So I'm not sure how you would answer to that.
Well, in regards to the first part of your question, I completely agree. Man, how do I tackle that? I still think half the story is very important. It's quite sad that, you know, we tend to, because there is only half the story, war can be quickly glorified. And the way soldiers are presented and the snippets we get of conflict definitely glorify the war in a sense, and they present a dimension which is a very two-dimensional look at the war, I guess. And I don't really know what the solution to that is. There has been some good work done by people who have embedded with different insurgent groups. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened often enough. And it's work that's been done by people who are Islamic, and that gives them a credibility to be able to do that. But it's not possible for me. Yeah. And sorry, what was the second half of your question again? Was
the difference between the two, when you're a freelancer. I mean, it actually was quite striking that, first of all, there were a lot of the early photos you were showing us were in black and white, but which is one thing. But the mood even of that, the polling in Kabul, was obviously very different to those later ones. But do you see a difference in the work that you do as a freelancer and the work you do for a magazine, say like Time?
Yeah, I don't differentiate that much. I just chose to explore that story with a different visual language because I felt that visual language brought something more emotional out of the story, basically. And I don't really, in regards to my work for Time magazine, I don't really think their editorial policy has a big impact on the way that I work. And they've been pretty brave with some of the stuff that they've published from me. I was with a platoon of US Marines recently in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, and they killed a civilian girl in a mortar strike, which was just, you know, terrible. And the moment I had these pictures, I mean, Time magazine really pushed that. So, you know, it's definitely one side of the story, the work that I do, but when I find, you know, cracks in that, I think there's a lot of publications which are happy to support it and are happy to present stories which show the complexity of the conflict.
Okay. Let's go, sitting next, and then we'll come to you. Thanks.
My question is about the ethics, basically. And some critics say showing violent images containing blood and dead children, for instance, some kind of immunize the audience, and so they don't care about the conflict anymore. And some say not showing anything to people is not journalism. So what should be the ethical limits of showing conflict images as what do you think as a photojournalist?
I think the bloodier the better. And I think that we don't see enough graphic imagery in mainstream press and in papers. I think the way the war is presented is sanitized on many levels. But I think what's also important to that, because it does present the war in a very one-dimensional way, is to explore. Is to challenge, I guess, the romantic notions of war. And there's lots of those that exist within popular culture, whether it's, movies and books and whatnot. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get across in my work, and I'm not sure whether I'm doing it successfully yet, but is to explore the quieter moments of war and to see what's going on in there, and basically to try and present the tension and the boredom, the frustration. A lot of these troops joined, you know, the military in this spirit of post 9/11 nationalism, wanting to kind of run off and fight the Taliban and, you know, avenge what happened in New York. But when they get out there, they realise this war is very complex, and they're not really fighting this entity which we keep presenting in the mainstream media, which is, you know, Taliban, Al-Qaeda. On the ground, it's very differently. You know, there's all these different factions and tribal groups, and I think when guys hit the ground and they start engaging with tribal politics and a provincial level, I think they get very challenged, and all these things come up. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get at with my work, is that boredom and frustration and sense of disillusion with this war on terror that we're waging.
Okay, I think we'll come here and then we'll jump over.
In many of your images, it seems like you've gained a very personal relationship with your subjects. How do you go about getting such a personal such personal access? Like, what do you have any strategies for doing that, especially in the quieter moments when it's not heat of the battle and everyone's just doing their thing?
I think it's quite important as a photographer, I guess. It doesn't matter whether you're in conflict or working on a story in, you know, Australia or America or wherever, but is to quickly assimilate in a situation and gain the trust of people. And how do you do that? I guess that's just a natural skill that you either have or you don't, but you just be human. You sit down, you ask them questions, and you be sincere about wanting to understand what it means to be somebody and what their plight is in life. And that's how I do it with the military, really. I get out there and I keep up, which is quite important. That's how I gain the respect. I keep fit. I put myself on a bit of a training program before I embed. So when I get out there, I can keep up with the guys on the patrols, and they feel like they don't have to carry me, and I carry my own water. And, you know, they quickly respect you when you can do that. And I sit around, talk about cars and girls and all kinds of stuff with them, and, you know, hang out, really. And, the pictures start to unwind after that.
I mean, one thing about being embedded is that you're there for a long time, and there's what Adam is saying about the kind of the boredom, there's a lot of that, and so there's a lot of time to kill. So you do end up talking, and you know, whole days, maybe even weeks can pass where not a whole lot happens, and then suddenly you'll have an intense couple of days. So just by human nature, you end up making connections, I think.
Yeah, conflict definitely isn't this exciting thing where you're getting shot at every day, and it's intense. Most of the time it's very boring, and you're doing long patrols and you're waiting for, you know, something to happen, which is, you know, a weird situation to be in as a journalist, because you're there and you don't want to get hurt, and you make friends with people and you don't want to see them get hurt, but you're also there to photograph people getting hurt. So, you know, that presents a bit of an emotional conflict you have to reconcile as a human being, really.
Okay, I think we'll jump across and then come back, if that's okay.
Some of the other conflict photographers who've talked here and who've been doing it for a long time, it actually screws them up, actually. So how do you deal with it?
How do you deal with it? I'm kind of working that out at the moment. But, you know, I must admit, in the last 18 months, I've had troubles dealing with it at times. You definitely get in a sense of, I mean, you know, I'm sure most of the audience has read books by, you know, Don McCullen or whoever, where we've, you know, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress have been identified, and there's this sense of feeling addicted to war or wanting to keep doing it, and that's a reality that you definitely have to face. You know, when you're in a war zone, you know, you crave leaving, you want to get out of there, you want to get back to your, you know, whatever it is you're doing, back to your girlfriend or your wife or your family, or just back to sit around with your friends and have a beer. And you really look forward to that. And then when you get out of a conflict situation, you can feel very detached very easily, and you actually just want to dive straight back into it. And I've caught myself a few times telling all my friends I'm going to have 6 months off and not go back to conflict, and then the moment I'm out, I'm manifesting my next assignment or trip back to Afghanistan. But I've taken a break in the last few months, and, you know, just had a bit of time off, and you just kind of work it out. You force yourself to. I guess some people handle it better than others, and I'm not really sure why that is.
Okay, we'll go here and then come back.
How do you choose whether to take black and white pictures or color pictures?
I think you choose the language you want to use on a story. I think we're beyond recognizing that a photograph is truth in this day and age. And what we do is go out and interpret an event or interpret facts and draw our own impressions from them. So I think it's just a matter of personal taste and expression, what you feel like is going to accentuate the story and do the story justice. And personally, most of the time I work in colour.
So then the decision, say, to take those photos in black and white, why did you do that?
Why did I do that?
What was your thought process to wake up one day and say, okay, I'm going to do this in black and white?
One of the very superficial reasons was that I wasn't on assignment, and I felt like it was a way I could feel excited about photographing, because I'm not used to working like that. So it was a bit of a liberating process to try and tell a story with a bit of camera blur and just create pictures that were more emotionally charged and were a bit more evocative, really. That's basically why I made that decision. And I felt like, I was photographing so many different things over the election period, and a lot of the, like say the campaign rally was full of these blue posters, and the blood in the hospital where I photographed the woman was very intense in the stretcher picture, and I felt like stripping all that out of it actually made it resonate as a series better. Sometimes stripping the colour out of something can add to it rather than take away from it, I think.
Okay, let's go here.
I want to take it back to the question about being in bed.
Mm-hmm.
You're there to tell a story. These guys you're hanging out with for days and weeks and months, they're there to fight the war because they think it's right for their homeland and that bad enemy they have to fight. Does that sometimes lead to, I don't know whether you're for the war against, but you said you would also be in bed with the insurgents.
Mm-hmm.
So does that sometimes lead to some personal conflict? Do you take yourself completely back there, like you have no opinion, or do you talk something they would like to hear? How do you do that?
I definitely tone down my left-wing politic when I'm engaging with the troops, and that's part of the trick of gaining their trust, I guess. But I definitely call myself an anti-war photographer. I'm not pro-war. But at times there's a real conflict, because I'll be out with these guys and they'll storm into an Afghan village and into somebody's house, and the women are scattering and they don't take their shoes off when they enter someone's home, and I'm on that surge with them, and I don't take my shoes off either, and I get the same disillusioned stares from the locals and the women and the men, and that can be very confronting, because you can quickly feel like you're also an occupier, and in a sense I am. I'm not showing the respect that I would if I was working on my own terms. But there's also the line of, I feel like I have to be a sympathiser of the grunt on the ground, and if I'm not there to try and create a sense of compassion for that person, I may as well not be there. And I think through creating that sense of compassion, even though it's a very fine line between being pro-war or anti-war, I think I can create a dialogue, or hope that I add to a dialogue and a criticism of the war through an understanding of these young guys that are out there, basically fighting our war on terror and the war on terror that we all pay our taxes to support.
This is kind of the follow-up question, maybe the bigger version. With your experience, how do you feel the surge is going, and from your personal point of view, and the guys you're with, what is their attitude? Do they think it's a futile situation, or are they still true believers?
I think they're very challenged, and I don't think there's very many true believers once they've been on the ground. And to quote a Marine captain when I was on my last embed, he said to me off the record that this democracy in a box isn't working, because they land in these areas, and with this troop surge they're basically pushing into areas where nobody has been for quite some time. Especially in Kandahar province, which has constituted most of the surge this year, these extra 30,000 troops. the 101st Airborne pushed into Kandahar province. And they're going to places where nobody's been since the Canadians were there in 2007. So they're these strongholds, and, you know, these guys are going in, setting up combat operations posts and trying to implement these, you know, systems of democracy and stability in these villages. And it just doesn't work. The Afghans are very proud people. They're mountain people, as well as people that live in very, you know, desolate, a very desolate environment, and they don't get it. You know, the whole. I mean, this is probably a personal observation more than anything else, but it's a very condescending thing for a bunch of, you know, young army guys and marine guys to push into a village and be telling a 60-year-old man how he should be running his village. And essentially, I think most of the time the Afghans smile, and they've seen people come and go, and they take what they exploit situations, you know, to serve themselves, which is fair enough in many ways. I got sidetracked from your question here, didn't I?
No, that's actually the question.
Right.
You're right on.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not really a winnable situation, bottom line.
I don't think it's a winnable situation. I think the guys at the forefront of it don't see it as a winnable situation either.
In terms of photography, I'll come to you just in a sec. In terms of photography, okay, so the Marine captain says what he said. How do you show that? Because you're a photographer, you're not a writer. Mm-hmm. How do you show that sense of disillusionment and the fact that democracy in a box isn't working?
Right. It's a very hard thing to capture, actually. I'm not sure I've managed to capture it successfully, but I guess as a photographer is looking for that tension between the Afghans and the military. And that can, you know, that's visual and there during things like village shuras where, you know, Marines or soldiers will sit down and engage with Afghans, or just looking for moments of tension. But it's a very hard thing to capture, and maybe I'm not getting it.
Okay, let's go. I think a question up here, and then we'll come to you.
Hi. I was going to ask a question about censorship from the army, the people when you're embedded, but I think more interesting for me is the self-censorship. I just want to know, were there any occasions when you didn't take a picture when you might have done because of maybe bonds that you made with the soldiers? And further, are there any photos that are for your own personal consumption that you wouldn't necessarily put out in the public, or alternatively, do you put everything out there and believe that's the best way forward? Right.
I've never photographed anything that I haven't put out. If I felt that it was pertinent to the story and an interesting image. There has been situations where I haven't photographed, and there's certain rules, there's certain ground rules that the military makes you sign about photographing. You're not supposed to photograph detainees, and there's been times where I've seen detainees and I've thought about photographing, and I haven't photographed. One particular time I was coming off a helicopter in Helmand province, and there was a bunch of special forces guys shuttling this detainee onto a helicopter, and he was blindfolded and tottering along, and I was looking at this guy thinking this is probably the first time this guy's ever been on a helicopter, and he's blindfolded. You know, it was almost like a villager in a spaceship kind of thing. It had a real colonial kind of like a space age colonial kind of feel to it. And I didn't photograph that day because I just landed at the base, and I knew that the guys would have got the shits with me straight off the bat for photographing something that I wasn't supposed to. So you learn to, you play the rules. I mean, if something had been happening that I thought just had to be documented, I would have broken the rules and I would have ruined the rest of my embed, and I would have felt that picture was worth it. But in that case, I didn't feel like it was worth compromising the rest of my trip, so I didn't.
Okay, let's go. This woman at the back.
First of all, congratulations on a really stunning selection of photographs.
Thank you.
I can't imagine how difficult it is taking good photographs in conditions like that. I wanted to ask you about light.
Sure.
In photographs I've seen of Afghanistan, quite often it's strikingly different from other places. And I felt in your first series of photographs particularly, it was almost like you'd lit some of the shots yourself, which I don't imagine you had.
Right.
And did you find that it was different taking photographs there from in other places where you've taken photographs in the past, or is it just skill, or is it something that I'm imagining?
I think as a photographer, you definitely try and use your craft, and use the the available resources, which is light. So there's times when I'm looking for situations which are lit well, and there's times where things happen which could have made a quite interesting photograph, but the lighting is just so horrible. It's hard to bring out, a sense of drama. The first set of pictures were taken in the northeast of Afghanistan, in the mountains, and it was very overcast and there was a lot of clouds, so the light was very diffused the whole time. So it made it easier to photograph. Whereas I've embedded in other parts of the country, in the south, and the light's incredibly harsh, and it's really hard to get those soft tones in your pictures. Yeah, especially in the middle of the day. Yeah.
But perhaps, I mean, especially on that kind of run from Kabul out to Bagram Air Base, which is a couple of hours outside of, there is a very special light in Afghanistan, or there can be in the late afternoon especially.
Yeah,
no?
in a sense, yeah, there is. In a sense, it's a bit like Australian light. It's I don't know. It has a quality. I'm not really sure what creates it. I don't understand the science behind it. But yeah, the light in Afghanistan's gorgeous.
Okay, maybe over here, and then we'll come back over here.
When you finish an embed, I guess can you kind of describe how you stay in contact, or if you stay in contact at all, with the people that you've been embedded with and that you've built relationships with?
I do stay in contact with guys that I've forged relationships with, and I quite often, a lot of them will email me and get very excited about seeing their pictures, so I send them some pictures. And at some point I would like to, maybe follow up with some of these guys when they've finished their deployments and they're back in the States, or they take leave and travel. So yeah, I do form friendships with some of the soldiers and Marines that I spend time with, absolutely. And being shot at's quite a bonding experience, so even though I'm not a military person, when you've been in very extreme circumstances with people, you tend to be drawn together by something.
Okay, maybe, yeah, just there, and then we'll come back over here, sorry.
You mentioned that at the beginning of your talk that when you first went to Afghanistan you were freelance, and that you worked a little bit with some other photographers. I'm wondering what your relationship is like kind of in general when you're freelancing with other photographers, whether you seek them out or whether you see them as competitors, how you kind of navigate that.
I think we tend to seek each other out. It's, being a photojournalist is quite a lonely profession, and we all end up in various parts of the world, and I think we tend to congregate and pool resources, share information. Quite often we'll share cars and do the same trips together. So there's a very strong camaraderie, I think, between the photojournalism community out there in the field, and that's amazing.
Sort of attached to that, what is your relationship with the print and broadcast journalists who are in the field?
It's similar, but because us photographers are really seeking to get as close to what we deem is relevant to the story as possible, we tend to travel a lot of the time without writers and the broadcast guys. We get in a crew and we go and seek out our stories, whereas I think a lot of writers can work, say in Afghanistan for example, a lot of writers can work in Kabul, or they can go to the certain fringes of stories, but they don't have to really experience and live a story firsthand for days on end to grasp it. Whereas as a photographer, to grasp it visually and to have that evidence in pictures, you have to spend quite a lot of time engaging very directly with things that are going on. So that creates a bit of distance, I think, between photographers and storytellers that work with other mediums.
And I would say, just as an adjunct to that broadcast journalists, TV journalists, especially for kind of big American networks or whatever, they have a pretty big footprint. So I would say, on the whole, both photographers and reporters tend to try and be as far away from them as possible, because they just, they'll change the situation a lot more than one person going in with a notebook or maybe even a camera. It would be my observation.
Sort of going back to when you were working in Delhi in India, really, and I was just wondering about when you're working completely independently, when you're going into certain situations where people might not be so willing to maybe have their photo taken and build up that trust. Did you find quite difficult, sometimes met with a frosty reception, and especially if you were going in with other people? How did you sort of work that out?
Well, it depends on the situation. If the situation is sensitive, people definitely can be a bit frosty straight off the bat, and I think it's one of those things where you just have to invest time. And if you linger for long enough, people will take you in like a bit of a stray dog, you know, and I guess that's what a lot of us photographers are. So that's how I overcome that obstacle. And I work with some incredible local journalists who manage to bridge that language gap and that cultural gap, and, you know, create access for you, which allows you to work.
Is that usually a case of people you meet out in the field, sort of just, like you say, spending time and finding local sort of people?
Sorry, I don't quite understand that last bit.
No, it was just a continuation of what you were saying.
Okay, right.
Okay. How are we going for time, Flora? We're okay.
Hit me with
it.
I was just wondering, with that question about India again, the leap between India and Afghanistan is quite enormous, sort of, you know, quite stable growing country to war zone. What events sort of led up to that sort of career path change? And was it people like Simon saying things like, "Oh, you're very brave with these Maoist rebels," and you know, how did you decide that you wanted to go into war photography, not carry on in more stable situations?
Right. I think I always knew that I wanted to dive into conflict at some point. I mean, you know, the decision to become a photojournalist was very influenced by work that I'd seen, you know, during Vietnam, Don McCullen, you know, Larry Burrows, a lot of other photographers. So that was always something that was eating away at me, and I basically built up to it. And I spent 2 years in India before I did my first trip to Afghanistan. And India was, in a sense, I always knew it was my training ground. And I think it was Simon, actually, when I first started talking about going to Afghanistan, Simon suggested that I apply for the Rory Peck bursary and do a hostile environments course. And I actually did that. I followed Simon's advice, and I went and did this course and bought my body armour and went back to India. And it wasn't long after that that I, you know, decided to dive on a plane and see what was on the other side of Pakistan. Yeah. And conflict definitely isn't the only thing that I want to cover in the war in Afghanistan. There's other things that I'm working on, and
in India you'd done kind of a whole mix of things, right? I mean, you'd done kind of urban poverty, the new India, the kind of incredible growth, the Maoist rebels, a real mix of stuff,
I had,
which India actually lends itself to beautifully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had worked on all kinds of stories. I'd been to Kashmir a couple of times. Yeah, and at some point, I will continue to do, you know, work on a much broader level. I just feel like at the moment I have a lot of momentum, and I think, you know, as essentially an artist, when you stick your teeth into something, you kind of want to hold on to it and bring it to fruition and really get into it. And I think at the moment I owe that to the story and to my own body of work to bring it to something. And I don't feel like I've got the energy to transcend that body of work until it's done, and then I might go and do something completely different.
One technical question, maybe even for the photography students here. When you go out on an embed, what equipment do you take?
Well, you have to have a body armour and a helmet for the military to accept you.
Right.
So I have my own body armour and helmet. And you need a sleeping bag. And
camera-wise, what are you taking?
I normally take 2 cameras and a couple of lenses. And when I'm on patrol, I normally just patrol with 1 camera and 1 prime lens, a 35mm lens.
So you don't have a second camera in case?
Yeah, I keep it on the base. So if I ruin my first one, I have another one out there with me. But I don't. It's too heavy to travel with a couple of cameras. A lot of photographers do it, but I find it a bit cumbersome, so I don't do that. Yeah. And you know, any things that you need beyond the meal ready to eat rations that you're going to get issued by the military, some lollies, some cigarettes. It's always back to developing a bit of rapport with the troops. It's nice to turn up with a couple of cartons of Marlboro Red and you can quickly make new friends. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? One here.
Hi, Adam. Going back to what you said about some people possibly criticising your work for being too much like standard war photography, I'm just wondering how, in the confines of doing an embed in a war zone, which, as we've heard, is often very boring, and then sort of interspersed with short periods of activity, how do you think going forward you might develop your work so that you avoid these criticisms in the future? I mean, to be honest, I liked your work. I thought it was good. It wasn't, as you say, it wasn't sort of gung ho, pro-war. Sort of typical heroic action kind of stuff. There was some emotion and I thought you captured a lot of people's sort of looks and feelings and what have you quite well. But yeah.
How do you move beyond? How do you address some of those criticisms?
It's like being stuck in a white room and being told not to take pictures of white walls. How do you?
Well, what do you? Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I'm not really sure how I'm going to do that. It's something that I'm trying to reconcile at the moment. But I think it's focusing on the non-sensational moments. And I think a lot of the pictures I showed weren't from, moments of full-blown conflict. And I think it's focusing on more on that, more on those kind of intimate moments, quiet moments, times when there's not a lot going on, and seeing what you can find within that, and developing imagery that explores the relationships between soldiers and contextualizes these people as human beings. And I think being able to deconstruct this notion of soldier and warrior is a way that I can try and create a dialogue which is maybe more healthy, and have us thinking about the war in a new way, and maybe have us thinking a bit more critically about the war. And it's also, I think, looking at the conflict as a bit of an anthropologist, and something that I feel I haven't done enough as a photographer is photograph the details of a war. Like the letters people get written, the food, all the things which are very relevant and provide lots of interesting questions, I guess.
Okay, any more questions? One last one here.
I guess I'm curious if, on a personal level, you wonder if you're worried about whether or not the career, particularly conflict photography, but just sort of photojournalism in general, is sustainable. If you're worried about security, if you're worried about establishing relationships, having a home base, you're not really bothered by it.
No, not at all. I get very insecure about being a photographer, especially a freelance photographer. You're really only as good as your last assignment or your last personal project. So that's a question that pops up all the time. It's very hard to have relationships. There is no financial security. I don't really know what financial security is. So it's something that you kind of have to battle, and especially in the current editorial climate, assignments are a bit harder to come by. When we look at bodies of work that have been done in the past, like I guess one of the most famous ones we can think of is, say, James Natchway's Inferno. And a body of work like that has really been produced, on assignment by people, investing and giving somebody the liberty to explore stories and put together a body of work over, a decade or a decade or two in some cases. And that, in the current editorial climate, that doesn't really happen anymore. I guess all us photographers are challenged by how to generate the funding to continue to tell stories and to approach subjects on an in-depth level with lack of funding. So yeah, I'm insecure about that. I've been very lucky so far, but we'll see. Did that answer your question? Cool.
What's your next assignment?
My next assignment, I'm going to Dublin tomorrow to do a story on the economic crisis. Yeah.
Okay.
So very different to Afghanistan.
Thank you to everyone for coming along tonight. I hope that you've enjoyed listening to Adam and hearing about Afghanistan. I think it's been an interesting conversation. Any final questions before we go? One last one up here.
And what about any personal project for the future? Not Afghanistan, but something different, maybe.
I've just moved to Laos as my new base, and I'm living quite close to the Mekong River. And I've also decided to do this as part of my my therapy, post-war therapy, is to explore the Mekong River and to cruise up and down it and see what I can find, you know, and have that be something that I explore in my own time and on my own terms and free of the control of the military or, you know, anything else, and have a bit of fun with it. So that's basically my project that I'm going to be, personal work that I'm going to be working on.
Okay. So I think on that note we'll wrap it up. Thanks again for everyone coming along.
Thanks everybody for listening.